Hi guys, Todd here and welcome back to Ask DRTK. This is my part 2 in the Focusrite Control series where I'm going to take a look at some of the advanced features and functions that you can use with your Scarlett and Clarett interfaces. If you haven't seen part 1, I encourage you to check it out. I'll leave a link down in the description. And so today I'm going to take a look at clock and synchronization. We'll look at digital I/O, ADAT, SPDIF, how those might be used. We'll get into Loopback as well and get some ideas of where we might be able to use Loopback to make our audio routing a little bit easier. We're going to talk about how to patch in outboard gear using your Scarlett or Clarett interface for live use, because not always is the DAW going to be available. So that's another way you can really level things up by taking advantage of the extra inputs and outputs on your interface. We'll even take a look at using the iPad as a remote control surface so you don't have to keep Focusrite Control open on your screen. And so before we get into the advanced functions like sync, clock, ADAT, etc., first thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit about setting up standalone mode. And what standalone mode means is when you want to use the interface but not have it connected up to a computer. And that can be useful if you'd like to use it for an outboard preamp or for a DAC. And so I'm going to use the example here on the Scarlett ADAT. And what I've done is I've set up for line out 3 and 4, and you can see that I've turned analog 1 and 2 on, and I moved the pan left and right so that I'm isolating, channel 1 into output 3 and channel 2 into output 4. You can also do this on the SPDIF output, and that's really useful as well because now I have a digital output. So I can have my analog inputs on the ADAT, the preamps, again, one going to the left channel on SPDIF and the number 2 going to the right channel on SPDIF. And so this allows me to use the preamp only on the ADAT, not connected to a computer. I can do this either through the analog outputs or with the SPDIF output. So really useful, if you want to use this with another device, another interface, maybe you want to add and use an extra couple of preamps. Maybe you have an 18i20 and you also have something like an ADAT around. There are other interfaces that this will work with as well. But the idea here is now you have 2 more channels, 2 more preamps. Now let's take a look at how to set this up for a DAC. And so once again here in the ADAT, this time I'm in the monitor outputs, and you can see that I've raised the level on the SPDIF up. And the idea here is so anything coming in on the SPDIF connection is going to be sent out through the analog outputs on 1 and 2. And so now we have a basic DAC set up. We can use this for headphone monitoring as well. Here I'm going to go ahead and just change around. I'll reduce the outputs from analog 1 and 2, the direct monitoring. This is on outputs 3 and 4. And then by raising the output with the SPDIF here, I'll bring it up to unity gain. What happens is now my headphone outputs, both of them will give me the output from the SPDIF input. And so again, I have my ADAT now set up as an outboard freestanding DAC. Really useful again if we want to add extra channels, use it maybe as a monitor controller. A lot of great opportunities to use this as an outboard DAC or as an outboard preamp. So before we can use the ADAT or SPDIF functionality, we need to set up the clock sources. Okay, and so again, I've dropped out here into the ADAT. I'm going to go into the settings section, and you'll see that I have options here in terms of the sample rate and also the clock source. And on the ADAT, it gives me internal or SPDIF because we don't have ADAT or word clock outputs here or inputs. Now, what we set it on depends on how we're going to use this interface. So if I was going to use the ADAT as a standalone preamp and I wanted to send digital out to another interface, I would actually use the internal clock and then set my other interface up to use the SPDIF as the clock. And that way it would sync up to the ADAT. On the other hand, if I want to run a device into the ADAT as another preamp or source, then I would use the SPDIF sync and I would set the other device on its internal source. So it's a little bit opposite of what you'd normally think. So again, if you're going to go output from the ADAT or any other interface that supports SPDIF, you want to use the internal clock and then set the device it's going into to sync up to SPDIF. On the other hand, if you want to run something into the ADAT, you actually need to sync externally to the SPDIF from that device that's coming in. Now we'll go ahead and load up the Scarlett 18i20. That's a pretty common use case for this as well. We'll talk a little more about clock. Now, if your Scarlett or Clarett interface has both ADAT and SPDIF coaxial connections, you're going to also have an option for digital I/O mode. So now back in Focusrite Control, looking in the settings section, we have digital I/O. And what we have is three options here on the 18i20. And again, this will be the same for all Clarett interfaces. And again, if your Scarlett has both optical and SPDIF coax connections. And so we have first SPDIF RCA. And what that means is I can send and receive SPDIF over those RCA connections. And I can also use ADAT channels 1 through 8 on a Lightpipe, but again, only a single cable here. So this is all 8 channels on one. Now, if we go to SPDIF optical, all that's going to do is use the optical connections for SPDIF instead of for ADAT. And then the dual ADAT mode is actually going to allow channels 1 through 4 to go through one set of ADAT connections and channels 5 through 8 through the other set of ADAT connections. But this will disable the SPDIF function, and this is going to be usable with higher sample rates. But again, we're going to sacrifice being able to use the SPDIF output and input. And so again, it's important to choose the right digital I/O. And the thing is, it can be a little misleading. When you choose SPDIF, that doesn't mean only SPDIF. It means SPDIF plus ADAT 1 through 8 on a single Lightpipe. Whereas when you choose dual ADAT, you can use ADAT with higher sample rates, but you lose the SPDIF control. And of course, the SPDIF optical is a little more obvious. You're sending SPDIF via an optical cable instead of an RCA cable. And so before I get into ADAT setup, I'll take a quick look at monitor selection as well as some of the special modes available on the Scarlett 18i20. So once again, in the 18i20 here in Focusrite Control, looking down, you will see monitor control, and this is something that's going to be available in a number of the Scarlett interfaces as well as the Clarett interfaces. And what this controls is the monitor level knob on the front of the interface as to which outputs it's going to control. So right now I have this set as 1, 2, which means as I turn that dial, and I'll just go over and turn it, you'll see that it's going to adjust the slider here for number 1 and 2. Now, I can have that control more than one set of outputs. If I select 1 to 4, you'll now see it's controlling the levels on both 1 to 2 and 3 to 4. And so that's the idea, and you can select as many as you have outputs here. Now, that's standard, again, across a number of Scarlett and Clarett interfaces, depending on the number of outputs you have. Another feature that's available on the 18i20 is the idea of speaker switching. And so right now I have it disabled, but if I enable it, what it'll allow me to do is use the button on the front to switch between 2 sets of studio monitors. Maybe one is a regular set and one's a set of mix cubes, or maybe I have hi-fi speakers on one or even computer speakers on one if I want to see how my mix is going to translate. And so just pressing the button on the front or selecting here in Focusrite Control will choose which monitor is being used. Now, another function that's available on the 18i20 is also the Talkback function, and you can see it's actually moving because the internal mic on the Scarlett 18i20 is picking up the sound for me in the room here. And I can adjust the level here. Again, that's activated by the talk button on the front of the interface. I can also do it here and have it locked on permanently by using Focusrite Control. And again, you're going to find this only on the 18i20. This doesn't apply to the Clarett interfaces. Okay, so I want to talk about the ADAT functions here. And again, I'm going to use the Scarlett 18i20 for this because it has the full set of outputs on it and inputs, and it really works exactly the same way on the Clarett. So because the 18i20 is such a commonly used interface, we'll use this as the example here. And so we have two kind of situations. We can either use ADAT from an input point of view if we want to bring additional ADAT sources into the 18i20 to be able to have those extra sources. Now, it could be an external preamp, could be multi-channel preamp, could be some kind of other audio device or mixer. There's a lot of things that support ADAT output. And so the Scarlett will let us bring those in. Again, the Scarlett 18i20 in this case. Now, the other way this can work, of course, is if we want to use the Scarlett, say the preamps on the Scarlett, and we want to send those out by ADAT, in order to be able to use them as inputs on another mixer or another interface. So let's get into Focusrite Control, and I'll show you both setups. Okay, so now I'm in Focusrite Control, and I already talked about clocking, but it's important to know that when you're doing this, you can set up to ADAT clock, and that will work bi-directionally. The nice thing about ADAT is that, you know, we can have either the sync coming in or going out, and it's just a matter of whether we want to have one device or the other be the master clock. Usually with ADAT, we pick the one which is kind of the highest quality unit that we think has the best clock in it. The other thing is if, of course, we have separate word clock connections, usually BNC connections, you can use those, and that will preclude needing to worry about what's happening, whether it be ADAT or even SPDIF. SPDIF's a little more fussy, again, as I talked about earlier. You have to bring typically from the source into the receiving items. But for ADAT, you can go either way. Now, I'm going to leave mine on SPDIF because, again, my configuration is set up with both SPDIF and ADAT, and it so happens that the clock source is coming from SPDIF. So now for ADAT, there's a couple of things. If we wanted to use the 18i20 as a preamp to send out via ADAT, what we would do is scroll down to the outputs here, and you'll see that we have all our ADAT outputs. And all we need to do is choose them and then configure what we want to go through them. So in order to do that, if I want to use my preamps, for example, and I want to send them by ADAT, I would go to Hardware Inputs, and I would simply choose Analog 1 and 2 for ADAT 1 and 2. And that's because I have it set as stereo. I can also go, and turn this off and make it mono and do each one separately. But I really find typically I just use stereo because I set them up in pairs. So now what I have is I have my analog inputs 1 and 2 going to my ADAT outputs 1 and 2. And I would do the same thing for 3 and 4. I just go into the playback here. I change it to hardware 3, 4. Then I go ahead into ADAT 1.5, 1.6. So that's ADAT outputs 5 and 6. Same thing. Change those to the hardware inputs 5 and 6. And finally, I would do the same thing on the ADAT 7 and 8 outputs. So again, hardware, and I'm outputting 7 and 8. Now, by doing that again, I now have preamps 1 through 8, channels 1 through 8 on the Scarlett, going out through ADAT on channels 1 through 8. And so my external device, whether it's another interface or a mixer, it can accept those as 8 more preamps with digital output. Really useful to be able to do that. Saves a lot of running of analog cables, and you get pristine digital optical sound in this case. So that would be, again, if we want to use the Scarlett as a preamp. Now, the other side is if we want to bring items in, that's pretty straightforward, because if we look at any of our mixes, for example, here, I'll go to I'll just randomly pick here number 3, and you'll see that, in fact, I have a signal coming through, and I actually have multiple signals coming through now because of the other connections that I made. But you'll see that I have ADAT inputs, and in order to use those through the analog outputs, all I need to do, of course, is just turn the faders up here on the Focusrite control on the mixer, and I will have those coming through output, in this case, output 3 and 4. If I want to split them up, say this is 1 and 2 on ADAT, all I do is I'll pan 1 all the way to the left, I'll pan 2 all the way to the right, and now what happens is I will have those coming through as outputs here. I'll unmute this, and you can see they're through here. You'll see I only have the left channel because that's the only fader I've turned up. If I turn up the right channel as well, now I have both channels coming through. And again, that's because the source that I have connected in via ADAT, the preamp, is outputting on both channels 1 and 2. This channel 3 is now coming back because, again, of what I did below. And so that's a great way to be able to do this. I could convert essentially digital to analog from ADAT this way, use the Scarlett 18i20 as an ADAT to analog converter. So I'd again have outputs, 3 and 4, just have ADAT 1 and 2 enabled. Then if I go to, and I would actually do this as the monitors. I would take outputs 1 and 2 and I would send them through monitors 1 and 2. Then on the on outputs 3 and 4, I would actually go ahead and put ADAT 3 and 4, and again I would pan those to the left and to the right. And outputs 5 and 6, I would get ADAT 5 and ADAT 6, and again I have them panned left and right. And the same thing would apply, of course, with 7 and 8. I just simply go ahead and level those two up, pan them to the sides, and now I have 8 ADAT channels in and all output to individual analog channels. Now, that is not necessary if you just want to use these for purposes with your DAW or for any other recording that might be happening on your computer. That's, again, only if we want to convert to analog through the Scarlett. So I'm going to turn them all back off just so that things are set up. And I'll actually go in and I'll disable all of those ADAT outputs that I set up earlier. And so now that I've reset everything back, you can see here again that I have my analog 3, and that's because the preamp, again, I'm using is connected into analog 3, but I also have it connected in via ADAT. And those signals are all available to my DAW. So I can choose any of these. And again, if I wanted to split them up and have this only, as a single channel, I could go ahead and pan it to one side, and it's there. I don't have to do anything with the outputs if I'm just using this as input for my DAW. And so ADAT is really useful. Again, multiple applications, whether you want to use it, your Scarlett as a digital to analog converter, an analog to digital converter, all via ADAT. You can use it to bring sources into your DAW, as well as output from your DAW. And it's just a little bit of configuration is required in Focusrite Control. Now we'll take a look at SPDIF. And if you made it this far and think you're getting some value, I'd appreciate you smashing that like button. It helps the video get to more people. That's just the way YouTube works. Now let's get back to Focusrite Control. And so earlier I told you that I had my Scarlett 8i6 set up in standalone mode connected via SPDIF into the Scarlett 18i20. And you can see I now have a signal coming in on SPDIF, in this case SPDIF 1, because I've connected another microphone up to the input number 1 on the Scarlett 8i6. And again, I have that coming out on SPDIF and coming in here to the 8i6. Now, to the 18i20. And so you'll see my clock source again here is set to SPDIF. And that's because, again, on SPDIF, when I'm using the 8i6 as the source into the 18i20, I want the 18i20 to clock to the 8i6. That'll avoid problems with crackling and other issues that can sometimes come up, particularly with SPDIF. Again, less of a problem certainly with ADAT and with word clock cables if you have a good one. And so I have that coming in. Now, these channels, both SPDIF 1 and 2, are available in my DAW. So I have access to the 2 preamps, in this case on my external, my 8i6 coming in through here. So I don't need to do anything for that. If I wanted to take those preamps, though, and add them to another output, say I wanted to have them come through outputs 3 and 4, well, it'd just be a matter of turning that slider up. And what would happen is then I would have the output coming through my output channel. So I'd be coming in as analog into the external preamp, in this case the 8i6, through SPDIF into the 18i20, and now going out through analog. And this can be useful, for, again, adding into monitor mixes, and I'll get into that shortly. But that's the kind of the most basic way when you're going to get SPDIF set up. If you want to use SPDIF as an output, again, it's just a matter of going into the SPDIF section and deciding what you want to send. And so again, here we're on the we're here in the 18i20, and so in this case, I have I can choose any of my signals here. I can choose any of the analog inputs, so the 8 preamps on the 8i6. I can also choose the SPDIF that's coming in from the external device. In this case, I have my 8i6 coming in here, using it as an external preamp, but also all of the ADAT channels. And I can map any of these in any mix that I want out here into analog, into SPDIF 1 and 2 rather. And that can be really useful because, if I want to use this again for an external monitor, I'm using external DAC to control my monitors, or I'm using an external DAC for headphones, I can go ahead and decide all of the channels that I want mixed in. So, if I want to have my preamp 3 coming in and going through SPDIF, I can just turn that on. And if I wanted to bring in, the additional signal that's coming from the other external preamp, I can go ahead and do that. In this case, that's the 8i6 that's coming in on SPDIF. And so now I have that. And I can choose, again, any of the sliders that I want. I can create a custom mix through SPDIF. Now, I get a lot of questions about Loopback. So let's take a look at a few of the ways we can use this. So again, I've scrolled down to the Loopback section here in the 18i20, and you can see right now that I just have it set up for software playback 1 and 2 looping back. And all that means is that channels 1 and 2 from my computer will actually show up like another input device in my DAW. So if I want to record my computer audio, I will have the loopbacks available. And the numbers in your ASIO driver they're assigned to depends on how many inputs you have actually on your interface. But the idea here is that I can record those back. Now, the interesting thing is, if you go in and look, you'll see that in this case here, I have playback 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, as well as 11 through 20. So these are all of my inputs, my actual channels coming out of the DAW that I can actually loop back into my into channels. So if I choose, 7 and 8, I can now have channel 7 and 8 from my computer looping back to the loopback source 1 and 2 that's available in the DAW. I can also use hardware inputs here. So if I want to create an extra set of outputs from any one hardware, my analog 3 and 4, for example, I can now loop those in and use, again, these virtual outputs on the computer, having extra channels. And this can be helpful for splitting things up. I'm going to do a whole separate loopback video talking about how to assign different channels to different applications on your computer and use that to actually split up and mix the audio. And this is going to be great for all you streamers out there that want to be able to control individual applications' audio using the Focusrite, Scarlett, or Clarett interface, much like you'd use a Go XLR or a Revelator. So really kind of a great use of loopback when you have multiple channels. You need to expose those on the operating system and then do some assignment of playback defaults using, I'll use Windows for the example, Windows Sound Manager control. But again, another video will have a lot more detail on that. But loopback's a powerful feature. It can be as simple, again, as sending all the audio from your computer back into 2 virtual inputs that you can record in your DAW or use for other purposes like OBS. But it's a lot more powerful when you start assigning more channels to it. Now, you can also use your Scarlett or Clarett interface to patch in outboard gear. And of course, if you're using a DAW, most have the ability to patch outboard gear in just like a plugin. But that may not be the case with all applications. Like Adobe Audition at the time of this recording doesn't support inserting external or outboard gear, or even OBS Studio if you want to use an external processor in line with your microphone. But you want to use the preamp maybe on your Scarlett, but you want to add in a compressor or you want to add in an equalizer. You can do that as long as you have an additional input and output. And so let's drop into Focusrite Control and I'll show you how to set that up. Okay, and back in Focusrite Control, you can see my standard setup here. Again, I have my single preamp, in this case coming in on analog 3, as well as a couple of ADAT channels. And what I've done is I've gone to line outputs 5 and 6. And this is because I'm going to use output 5 and input 5 to loop, in this case, it's going to be an EQ back through. And so what I need to do is get this signal, either the analog or the ADAT, doesn't matter, to go out through output number 5. And so since I'm in here and I'm in output number 5, I'm just going to go ahead and choose my ADAT channel. I'll turn that up. And you'll see now that it's showing a signal back on input number 5. And so what I've done here is I have the output from the channel number 5 on the Scarlett going to the input on my external EQ. And then I have the output from the external EQ coming back to input number 5 on the Scarlett. So I've created a loop. And then here in Focusrite Control, I'm taking that signal from my ADAT and I'm sending it out, in this case, on output number 5. I could send it out on 5 and 6 if I didn't pan to the side, but I have these split channel by channel. And so my ADAT is going out to the EQ via output number 5. And of course, because I have the EQ connected back into input number 5, you can now see input number 5 is showing signal. And so the difference here is that the ADAT is the unprocessed signal. The analog 5 actually has gone out to the outboard EQ and come back into the Scarlett. And so this is really useful, again, if I want to send a signal through outboard gear. And this could be useful if you had, say, OBS Studio, where, again, it doesn't really have any ability to patch in outboard gear, but you didn't want to have processing running in the box. You wanted to keep as little resources as possible. And so this way you could add an EQ or a compressor in. It's a great way also if you're doing some live recordings and you want to go ahead and just insert some compression or some EQ, maybe some reverb even in, and bake that in, but not use plugins. And so Focusrite Control lets you do that. It lets you create essentially a patch bay within the interface. And again, depending which Scarlett model you have or which Clarett model you have, you will have more or fewer inputs and outputs. And so as long as you have at least one spare input and output, you can do this using Focusrite Control. And on top of all of that, what if I said you could use your iPad as a remote control surface for Focusrite Control as a mixer? You can have this sitting beside any other DAW controller you might have, mixing board. This gives you remote control without having to go into Focusrite Control on your computer or have the screen open. So now I've gone ahead and opened up a capture of my iPad so that you can see the screen. And if you notice when I slide the control up on the iPad, it actually changes the mixer level. In this case, it's line output 3 and 4. I'm moving that up and down on the iPad and it's moving. We can also do the same thing when we go into the mix. So right now I have mix 5 and 6 showing. If I go into mix number 5 and 6, now I'm going to ramp up the mixer on input number 3. And I can adjust that up or down. I can control the pan left to right. So I have a lot of control over that as well. And so full mixing is available on the iPad. We can also go into the input section. Now I'll switch over on Focusrite Control so you can see where we have control of the air function, pad, etc. And if you look here, I'll turn the air function on analog 1. Now I'll turn it off. And we control the pad function that way as well. We can switch between instrument and line. We can do that for all of the inputs. So really useful. And we also have a control over monitor mix. So if I go to the monitor section and I want to adjust what I'm mixing in there, I can go ahead and make those adjustments too. So really gives you a lot of control over what you're going to listen to through the various outputs, what you want your inputs set up as, monitor mixes, all from the iPad without having to have Focusrite Control open on the computer. Okay, and so to do that, all you need to do is go into the App Store and do a search for Focusrite Control. The app will come up. It's free. You can go ahead and install this. I already have it installed, so I would just click Open. And if I do that, go into Focusrite Control, what will happen is it'll come up and it'll list the interface. In my case, I have this 18i20 connected, so we'll go ahead and bring that up. And right away, we have all the screens. And again, we have access to all the inputs, the outputs, as well as a monitor control. We can go into the mixes. We can use the other functions like dim that this interface has. So a lot of options here for what we can do with Focusrite Control from the iPad. And as you can see, sometimes it's really handy to have your Focusrite Control mixer right beside your DAW control surface. It just gives you all those options, additional mixing available without having to go in and out of the application on your computer. Now, when you get your new Scarlett or Clarett interface, you can pretty much plug it in, install Focusrite Control to get the drivers, and you're done. But when you discover the visual interface and what you can do to reroute all of the inputs and outputs, it really opens up the possibilities, especially as you expand and need more inputs. You want to add outboard gear, different headphone mixes. So whether you're a two-person podcast or whether you're recording a multi-piece band, there's something in Focusrite Control I think that'll help you out. And if you want to learn more about audio gear for music production, voiceover, and streaming, check out one of the videos on the screen. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.